Hey guys, it is Thursday afternoon, just a little bit past 1 o'clock. A little earlier, not much. I'm here online googling some stuff, and no no topic off the top of my head yet. We'll see if anyone pops in. I'll try to keep the talk at about 20 minutes to half hour. We'll see. Whenever I have some training friends hop online, the conversation ends up being longer for good reason, as I have some great training minds here for conversation. So it's always, and not just on training, talk about music and some other things as well, which is always good. And it's always good to get, especially training, to get those other perspectives, how people do things. Yesterday we talked about form, which was a really good topic because I think a lot of times it is misinterpreted that we think of form as being universal. This is the way to do it. It's the thing with yoga. You have to adapt the form to your body, not your body to the form. Now, of course, there's proper alignment. You get that alignment in, and the rest is up to you. How far you go, how long you hold. These are the things that you have to address. They um, can't be something that you. Sorry, I'm still looking stuff up. They can't be something that you force to fit into the perimeters of what we consider is a good yoga form, good burpee form, good whatever. Now, of course, that's different with competition. When you abide by rules, bench press, you have to pause. Squat, you got to go just below parallel. Um, Deadlifts, you got to hold the bar locked down at the top. No movement, no hitching. So, for what we do, burpees and other fitness modalities, we don't have those type of rules. Adopt the form to your body, not your body to the form. That would be my suggestion. Obviously, everyone's going to do what they think is best, as it should be. Um, However, I dislike seeing people drive themselves crazy trying to. For me to get my form to look like someone else's, I would have to have probably um, some type of shoulder surgery. Um, I would need younger knees with less miles on them. Um, and I would have to start from scratch. However, for my body, I have perfectly serviceable form, which is good enough for me. Good enough for me to get my reps in. However, though, just watching Max, busy dad, um, get his 6 counts in today, and I am considering purposely dropping my reps and working back up because my reps are dropping just a little bit anyway. But I'm doing some very intensive yoga posture twice daily right now, um, holding them deeper, longer, and some poses that I haven't done in decades. So, and I'm doing it as part of a training course. So I feel like I need to adhere to the program, which means something's going to give, and most likely it's going to be burpees. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, I am giving up some reps. So it might be better to purposely step back and then just build myself up. Go down to 200 reps for 6 counts and build myself up two at a time, as Max is doing. Um, I would have a harder time going down on my Navy SEALs. That didn't sound right at all, did it? Going down on my numbers on that particular exercise maybe just trying to hold at 100 and then working my way back up by ones. We'll see. It's all good. One of the things that's taken place with me is a deep, with a, I don't want to say a deep dive in yoga. I've always been deeply driven, I don't know. Um, I've always had a great appreciation for yoga. I've always practiced yoga, and not just the asanas, but the actual um, science of it. And it truly, truly is a science. We could say the philosophy of yoga, but yoga itself, the full practice, is a science that has so many benefits on the body and the mind, spirit. It's a mode of living, a mode of expression. So that yogic thought, since I'm fully immersed more so than ever, and that's not a light thing for me to say, as I mentioned, it's always been a presence in my life. As it's really come full scale into other aspects of my life. I'm distracted because I keep looking stuff up. And let's see. And that's mainly because I am looking for a particular quote from the Yoga Sutras. Yoga Sutras were written, I don't know, 1,000 years ago or so. No, probably over 2,000 years ago. I believe Patanjali was a contemporary, maybe just after the Buddha, and the Buddha was about 2,500 years ago, give or take a couple hundred years. And Patanjali was a yogic seer who codified yoga principles. Very little talk of asanas in his Yoga Sutras. However, it's a guidebook for higher living. And particularly, Yoga Sutra 1.2, first chapter, second stanza. Sutra actually means stanza, and it is how we got the sutra of stitching, because it's considered like a short, precise saying, pithy instructions that tie things together. And with the Yoga Sutra 1.2, which is the first chapter, the second stanza, again, second sutra, he lays out the entire definition and purpose of yoga. And it really gets right to the matter of everything, why we practice. So I'm trying to find it. And it doesn't apply just towards those yoga stanza. It applies to everything we do. Particularly burpees is what I'm thinking right now. But I mean, we can liken it to any physical exercise, any mental pursuit, any artistic expression, honestly. All right, I think maybe I found something here. Yoga Sutra 1.2. Complete mastery. I guess I could have grabbed my book that I have right in the other room. Complete mastery over the modifications of the mind is called yoga. Breaking that down, modifications of the mind, we can call that the waves, the mental activity. It's coming to a calm, abiding place amidst the activity of the mind, which is also the activity of the world. And we notice that sometimes doing an asana when everything becomes perfectly still. the breath quiets down to this barely perceptible whisper. Heartbeat slows, muscles are locked in place, doing exactly what they want to do. You got that perfect poise. I love that word, poise. If we can achieve poise, and honestly, it's not really so much as an achievement as a revelation. That poise is that stillness of the mind and body, perfect union, which is what yoga means, right there in that asana. And then in hatha yoga, you follow that effort, effortless effort, with relaxation. You go from that effort of the pose, effort of the posture, to Shavasana, which is a corpse pose, or child pose, or the crocodile pose, where you're on your stomach, your head turned to the side, and you're resting, which is really sort of a complete display of our central nervous system, being able to go from that burst of sudden activity and yet remaining calm to completely relaxed, and yet remaining poised if we need to go back into action again. When we can do that, we've achieved that mastery over the modifications of the mind, as well as a semblance of control over our central nervous system. The yogis, of course, had, I would say, almost complete control over that. You can see it where they slow down their heart rate, where, again, it's barely perceptible. You can, at will, they can take it from here, see my hands, all the way down to here, or back up again. There's stories of yogis, and they've done this in laboratories where they, literally have them isolated, and a yogi will shut everything down except for what's barely needed. Heart rate low, breath rate low, brain waves extremely low, where if you didn't know better, if there weren't, the occasional beep of a machine of what's hooked up to their heart or their head, brain waves, you would think they were literally dead. It's not necessary to get there. It's enough. Remember the goal of yoga? The goal of Raja Yoga, which is very similar to Buddhism, is the recognition of the suffering in life, why we suffer. And again, I always try to make this distinction. It's not the suffering we think about when we think of children who are starving, someone who's dying of cancer, that physical suffering of sickness, or of a quality of life where their human needs aren't met. This is a psychological suffering that we all, especially in, hey Duncan, that we all get, particularly in Western world. That in Buddhism it's called dukkha, which has been mistranslated as suffering, but really what it means is dissatisfaction with life, where we think we're not at home in the present moment, is probably the best way we could sum it up. And it seems to be the psychological condition, particularly of the Western mind. We're never completely happy with how things are. We'd like to have a little bit more, or we'd like things to be a little less. We'd like to have more money. We'd like to work less. Nothing wrong with that. However, if it causes that sense of unease, of dissatisfaction, of literally suffering, then we should address the means out of that. And that's what the Buddha said, life is suffering. Life is suffering because we cling to things that are impermanent, which is everything in life. Nothing is lasting. Everything is changing form. If we cling to a particular form of anything, or if we push a particular form away, even though it's present now, then we're going to suffer, psychologically suffer. Raja Yoga, which loosely translates to royal yoga, is the same. It tells you that life is ever changing, brief. Everything that we cherish and love will eventually change form into something else. And it shows us a way out of that psychological suffering. That is the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra 1.2. Coming to that place, and it's good that I have my friend Duncan here, because he brought that up on a burpee video of mine. Coming to that point of being poised within motion. If you get that, it's been said, you get all of yoga. Now here, Patanjali calls it the modifications of the mind. Modification, he's just meaning the waves of the mind, the ups and the downs, the cherishing, the craving, the pushing away, modifications, everything, the mind never being still. And how do we get there? I sort of don't think we do. In Buddhist psychology, they tell you, and yoga will point to the same thing, the mind is already still. Well, let's backtrack on that. The mind actually is never still. The process of the mind is to think. And yet, there's something deeper than that. There is the ever spacious openness of our awareness, who we truly are, that allows for that motion to take place. So when we come to that stillness, it's not as if all our thoughts might stop. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we've come to that place of pure awareness where the thoughts are just going by and we're not attached to them. That's the art of meditation. That's the art of yoga. You come into your asana, you come into your posture, you do your burpee, but you are unattached to the motion that's taking place. That already exists. If you think about that awareness, when you were 1 year old, you were aware. You couldn't verbalize it. You couldn't put it into actual thoughts because you didn't have the mental process for thoughts to exist yet. Not in that way. Duncan said there are obviously some forms of suffering which lead to better status quo, than some forms of suffering which is simply suffering with no obvious benefit. Yeah. I'm not so sure though. Let me get to your second comment. Perhaps there should be different definitions of suffering, or perhaps an entirely different word thing to distinguish between the two. I agree. I tried to make that point just a bit earlier when I was talking about psychological suffering versus the suffering of a child without enough food, who has a terminal disease, or a parent who has lost a child, or a child who's lost a parent. That's a different sense of suffering, sorrow. Suffering in this sense is the, again, being dissatisfied with how things are, always needing to be somewhere else, or having the conditions that are in our life being different than they are. That doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt to make things better or want things to be different. But it means everything, or as Einstein said, nothing changes until something moves. So with that, it's like saying, accepting where we are so we can do things so that they're other. Duncan says, I guess 1, suffering child with illness, 2, suffering training to get fitter and healthier. Yeah, and that's sort of the point that I was trying to make. Except when we're trying to get fit, we're not psychologically suffering. We are, as Gurdjieff, the philosopher, would say we're voluntarily um, embracing that. What could be suffering for others, for us, it's joy. Um, so it's not that psychological suffering. There's so many paths through it that, it's hard to say. But when we accept that life is suffering, as it says in Buddhism, then we are already one step towards being free. Being free doesn't mean that we don't have that suffering. It means that we're not attached to not suffering. That last part, I think Duncan says, so many people I train think it's suffering. Well, yeah, that's because you're making them do jumping lunges and star squats and burpees with a jump at the end. That would be suffering for me as well. And I train every day. If you were to come into my basement and say, do a star jump, I'd be like, really, what have I done where I deserve such punishment from someone that I admire? Doesn't seem fair. So I think that's the key point. Liberation, as described in Buddhism or in yoga, isn't the absence of suffering. It's the absence of not accepting that there's suffering in life. That we realize this sucks. And it's okay that it sucks. It doesn't not have to suck. We're not saying this sucks, oh my God, I can't get by, I can't live like this. We're simply saying it sucks. That's what people do when they work out with you. This sucks, but they're not looking for a way out of it. Otherwise, they wouldn't show up to have you do it. So this is why Buddhism is better likely to find as psychology. Same with yoga, the deep yogic philosophy and psychology of not a way out of suffering, as is often described in the Buddhist path. As long as you're alive, there's going to be no small degree of things that suck, no small degree of suffering, of sorrow, of grief. The Buddha isn't saying don't grieve. The trainer Duncan Walsh isn't saying don't work out. They're saying that's part of life. Realize it, accept it, and be free. Duncan says, so if you had to do a 40-minute Navy SEAL session after 25 minutes, would you think I'm suffering here or that you are embracing the joy of movement? Both, honestly, because I can stop anytime. Suffering would be believing that I didn't have a choice, that I had to do this for whatever reason. But having the ability to stop, go upstairs and have a beer, okay, that would literally be an impossibility. I haven't had a beer in my house in 23 years. But that's the point, that for me, it wouldn't be suffering in the least, because I'm free of that attachment of my belief in what I'm doing. I don't have to say, do this rep or I'm going to die. Do this rep or I'm going to be in complete misery for the rest of the day. It is more, yes, this rep sucks, it hurts, but I get to do this. I get to do this every day. I get to be 58 and still do a 45-minute burpee or 40-minute burpee session. Duncan says, I think of an image of Hades as suffering, or that painting depicting migraines. Speaking of which, Mocha had a deliberating migraine yesterday. She suffered something really bad. Yeah, the whole images of hell, we always project them to be of a different world. And yet, metaphorically, the connection is this world and the hell that we lock ourselves into, because things have to be this one way. They have to fit our beliefs. A large amount of our suffering is because we demand things to be a certain way. The writer Ken Keyes wrote some bestsellers in the 70s, The Handbook to Higher Consciousness. He really gave a precise expression of Buddhism. If we simply up our demands to preferences, no small amount of suffering would be lost upon us. That life would just be degrees easier because of that. Just having a preference. If I demand this traffic jam be finished, if I demand this line to be shorter, if I demand the opposite political party think the way that I do, all these demands, I'm going to suffer. However, if I have a preference, I would prefer not to be in a traffic jam. I would prefer not to be in this long line. I would prefer my Navy SEAL session to be 20 minutes and not 40 minutes. Then I've alleviated, just to a degree, maybe 10% of that psychological suffering. My attachments are now just a preference. Duncan is giving the Wikipedia definition that suffering is the basic element that makes up the negative balance of affective phenomena. The opposite of suffering is pleasure or happiness. I would vastly disagree with Wikipedia, but I'm coming at it from an Eastern perspective, yoga and Buddhism, that joy and suffering, two sides of the same coin. Does it really have an opposite? As you were saying, that many of the people working out with you think of it as suffering, and yet they find happiness in being fit, being healthy, being strong and capable. You and I find happiness in the midst of a hard 20-minute session or longer. What yoga and Buddhism is searching for is that which doesn't change. And again, that comes to that awareness that knows happiness and knows suffering, and yet is unaffected by either of them. What is it that says that's suffering? What is it that says that's happiness? What notices it is probably the more important point. What is it that notices happiness? And if it notices it, that means it can't be it. It has to be the allowance of it. What is it that notices suffering? It's the same thing. When we notice happiness, there's that witness consciousness that is simply noticing it, that isn't involved in it, but allows for it to happen. When we realize that, when we see things from that witness perspective, everything changes. And we don't even have to stay there, because that's who and always what we are. It's that same awareness we had when we were one, even though, again, we couldn't verbalize it. It's the same awareness when we were a teenager. The same awareness as who Duncan and I are right now in our 50s. That's never changed. Always been the same. So when we just flip our attention back, that's when, again, everything changes, because it's not about happiness, and it's not about suffering, or it's not about sorrow. It's about witnessing happiness, being able to participate within the happiness. It's about witnessing sorrow, being a full participant within that sorrow, not trying to back out of either. Duncan says, I think that as hardcore fitness people, we don't really see tough training as true suffering. I agree, 100%. Suffering for us uniquely may be something entirely different. Good point to that is the same with meditation. I know people who simply feel that they are unable to sit and meditate for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. To them, it is pure hell, because their thoughts are driving them crazy. Their knees are cramping up. They can't keep their back straight. 1,000 thoughts a minute. And yet I find deep joy in meditation. And I believe everyone can meditate. They just need to be shown how to meditate. So, perspective. And Duncan continues with something that makes us intensely unhappy, whatever that may be, a job we hate, for example. Yeah, true. But again, if we can take it on from that witnessing sense of awareness, then it's, as Shakespeare said, nothing be good nor bad, lest thinking makes it so. Or he said something along those lines. Quoting Shakespeare for me is always an iffy thing. Quoting anyone for me is always an iffy thing. As long as I get the gist, as long as I get the to the point of the matter, I'll be doing okay. So more or less, it's our thoughts that make things seem unhappy, seem pleasant, seem good, seem bad, whatever. How miserable we might be in a job, someone else is thankful that they have the ability to put food on their table, feed their children. Perspective. But that point of pure awareness is the same for each individual. Some might say it's the same awareness, simply appearing, and we can call it infinite awareness appearing in the finite form of individuals. That would be the yogic perspective. Buddhism may be a little different. Duncan says, I always say, if someone is spending most of the time in this life doing stuff they don't like, something is wrong and you need to change. I would agree. Life, I think most of us will agree that it's definitely short. And what is the sense of spending it in misery if, as Duncan said, something needs to change? Who knows what? But here's the one thing that can change that we know of: our perspective. Maybe we can't change jobs. Maybe we're locked in place doing what we have to do to feed our family or whatever. Who knows why anyone is stuck doing anything? It's not for me to. It would be sort of like a shrug for me to say, if you're unhappy, get a new job. It's not that easy for everyone in the world. And I know that's not what Duncan is saying. However, we could change our approach to the job that we're doing. That would bring us back to Sisyphus, who, as Camus reimagined, found great joy in the routine of pushing that boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down again. He no longer suffered. He was no longer in hell. It was no longer the punishment that the gods thought it was, because he found meaning and purpose in that purposeless action of pushing a stone up a hill only to have it fall down again. I absolutely love that reimagining of the myth of Sisyphus, and I love the absurdist view of Camus. Duncan says, when I was 21, I worked in a bank. It was terrible. I would imagine it would be. I was getting to squash at the time, running before work and going to squash after work. Yeah, I've been in a similar jobs where I lived for the things I was doing outside of the job. When I was 21, I was washing dishes, and believe it or not, I absolutely loved it. I was training for backpacking and rock climbing, and I would run or ride my bike to work. I would wash dishes for 8 hours, and I would run or ride my bike home from work, take a shower, hang out with friends, or I'd go rock climbing, or I would make plans for my next backpacking trip. Duncan says, after 9 months, they handed out pension leaflets. That was the turning point. I thought, no way am I doing this, and left. And did a sports science degree. Good for you. If I could wish something for everyone, it would be to have that type of epiphany. You can do something different if you want to. A lot of people, what is it Thoreau said? We live these lives of quiet desperation. And we don't have to. Something can change. That's the one thing I love about yoga. It's the path of transformation. Without your outer world changing, your inner world changes. Not only your thoughts, not only your emotional set point, you come to a happier place. You've literally raised your happiness set point, emotional set point. The science shows we all have one. But you've changed your physiology as well. Duncan says that I was no standard at squash, but after 3 years, I was standard to go pro. I'm going to see if I can find a quote. Let's see. Who was it? He talked about that there is magic. There's magic in, sorry, I'm Googling. There's magic in pursuing your dreams, regardless of what that dream is. And that the world, literally, the universe literally conspires to help you reach that point. Duncan says, I think one should make a list of all the things that make you happy, then make a conscious effort to do more of those things. It's a good way to get through life. Here's something to imagine, Duncan. Imagine if it was a job that was slightly more bearable than working at a bank. Let's say the pay was a little better. They gave you 3-day weekends. No great big thing, but just enough that you were slightly less miserable in what you're doing. Sometimes we need that suffering. We need that misery to help us realize we would rather be doing something else. If you had suffered less in a bank, psychological suffering, obviously you weren't being tortured. They didn't hold a gun to your head and say, count this money by hand. Don't use those fancy counting machines. But you were unhappy. But if you were slightly less unhappy, who knows? It's like, I hate this analogy as a vegan. but it's like the boiled toad. If you take a toad and you put him in a pot of cold water, I should say frog, toads don't live in water. Take a frog and you put him in a pot of cold water and turn the heat on slightly. The frog will keep adjusting to the temperature until eventually he's burned alive. Although in my analogy, as a vegan, the frog gets so hot that he jumps out and saves himself. However, if you would take that same frog, and threw him in a pot of boiling water, he would immediately jump out because it would be too hot. Most of our lives, we get by on degrees of being unhappy. Yeah, this sucks, but not that bad. That's why people smoke. That's why people eat bad food. If someone were to smoke one cigarette and get 100% of the health hazards that happen, if you were to smoke one cigarette and get emphysema, and then lung cancer, and then heart disease, how many cigarettes would you keep smoking? If you were to eat one Big Mac and immediately gain 20 pounds and get high cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart disease, gout, lose your mobility, how many Big Macs would you eat? It's a boiled frog. You wouldn't. You'd jump out of the pot. But you have a nice cozy job in a bank. It's not what you want to do, but hey, you make decent money. You get the weekends. You get 3 weeks out of the year. I can get by. I can do this forever. So, in my opinion, Duncan, good for you for realizing, having that epiphany. This isn't what I want to do. I want something. I want a life of adventure. I want a life of true joy. Not just getting by. Not just being slightly happy 3 weeks of the year. Duncan says, not for me. There can be no compromise. I still would have left. I don't think there's a slightly nicer way of banking checks. Yeah, good for you. That puts you one step ahead of the game. There's a book, I got it somewhere, one of these shelves. Finite Games and Infinite Games. And it's realizing that life is based on 2 games. We have the finite game of jobs, of marriage, of raising kids, things that, they have a certain length of time. They're finite. Our lives are filled with those finite games. And then we have the infinite game. Infinite game is our pure existence. Why we're here to begin with. Where we'll be afterwards. The universe being expressed through us as who we are. The key is to realize the infinite games within the finite game. It's as Alan Watts talks about how as the ocean waves and trees leaf, the universe peoples. We are the infinite channeled down into finite form. When we realize that, it can all be a game. And no matter what the job is, we're not limited in that capacity. You're not a banker. You're the universe pretending to be a banker. You're not a yoga teacher. You're the universe pretending that you're the yoga teacher. Everything changes in that capacity. And that's, I think, what Shakespeare was getting at. That it's that perception. Finite games and infinite games. Nothing is good nor bad, thus thinking makes it so. What would be a miserable job for me would be, a love affair for someone else. Duncan says, so many people give up the dreams for a life they are okay with, just as they think, I've had enough of this. They get a paycheck and it sucks them back in. Yeah, that, again, Henry David Thoreau. Most people live a life of quiet desperation. just unhappy enough that they're have that psychological suffering, but not quite so unhappy that they say, screw this, man. I'm not doing this for the rest of my life. I've had enough. There's something more enjoyable, something better. But who's to say? I've known school custodians who were the happiest people in the world, even though from someone else's perspective, it would be a miserable job. Same with people working in a school cafeteria or school bus drivers. There's a theme here. Working with a large bunch of screaming kids would be hell. Duncan says, at 20 years old, I had an epiphany that I would one day be a world champion. And you also had the fortitude to pursue it. Duncan said, I spent 20 years pursuing it, kept losing the top players. It wasn't happening. My own epiphany was that I was simply not normal. That a normal life wasn't going to not just suffice for me, that it was a near impossibility for me. That I wasn't going to be pursuing a 9-to-5 career. That I wasn't going to be wearing a tie for my job. Duncan says, at 40 years old, suddenly, I won the British Open over 40s, effectively world champion over 40. See that? I knew there was a happy ending to this story. You had that epiphany and you followed through. I'm still looking for that quote. Dream no small dreams, for they have no power to move the hearts of men. And that would be what you did. You didn't dream small, Duncan. You didn't say, you know what, I'd like to be club champion. I'd like to be top 3 in my club. I wouldn't mind being better than this guy over here because he sucks. You went to the top. I want to be world champion. And you were. You put the work in and you got there. But you know what? None of that would have happened if you hadn't have said, I want to be, if you hadn't had that epiphany, if you hadn't said, 1, I don't want to work in a bank for the rest of my life. And 2, I don't want to just have fun playing. I want to see if I can be the best. Duncan says, failure cannot live with persistence. For me, I sort of redefined failure. I don't really see the failure in anything if I'm enjoying the journey. Especially realizing that there's no end point. It's back to those infinite games. Failure, here's what would have been a failure, Duncan. If you'd have said, I'm going to be a world champion by the age of 39, or I'm going to quit. You didn't do that. You just kept playing. Because that's what brought you joy. Failure is just feedback. Perfect. Absolutely. And it's what we do with that feedback that matters. If I define myself by that failure, I'm over. I'm done. May as well go to work in a bank. However, failure at 39 was success at 40. This is why I always, urge people to re-examine their beliefs. Don't be stuck in them. Don't be defined by them. Keep your thoughts flexible. Keep your beliefs flexible. Be willing to adopt a new belief or retire an old one that no longer serves you in such a way. I failed 3 times before I did my first 100. And I did my first 100 about 2 weeks after my 50th birthday. Somewhere around there, give or take a day or two. Had I set that time limit, I'm going to run 100 before I'm 50, maybe I would have needed that. Maybe I would have gotten it because I had that timeline, that energy. Or maybe I wouldn't have, and I would have branded myself a failure and quit the sport. But I didn't have the belief that age was the defining quality of my running career. I felt like I could run forever. And I literally did. Up until the point when I didn't feel like running anymore, and I felt like walking. And then I walked really fast a lot of races. And I beat a lot of runners just by walking, which, believe me, is a whole lot of fun. Because nothing pisses off a runner than being passed by a walker. I've been on both sides of that. I've been a runner passed by a walker, and I've been a walker passing runners. So I know that's true. Here's another quote. Whatever you can do or dream, begin it. Exactly what Duncan did. In the bank. We had a dream being a world champion squash player, and he began it. And it took, 20 years, you said? Absolutely amazing. I didn't start ultra running until I was 45. Before that, I was training kettlebell sport. Before that, I was training Olympic weightlifting, and then powerlifting, and then bodybuilding, other stuff in between. 45, I read a book, and I said, I'm going to be an ultra runner. And 3 months after reading that book, actually in 3 months of picking up that book, I ran my first 50K. Duncan has to run, not 100 miles though. Enjoyed our chat. I enjoyed it too, Duncan. Thanks very much. And I'm going to end the chat as well. Always enjoyable when Duncan comes along to have a conversation. And hopefully we're going to have a live conversation face-to-face sometime soon. Hopefully we'll make that happen. Everyone have a good day. And I will see you tomorrow for burpees and some more talk. I'll tell you what, I'll send you an email the next time on Google, the next time I go live. And if you can make it, awesome. And if you can't, that's fine too. But at least it'll be there, and you'll know. So take care, guys.